ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone had an opportunity to grab a non-alc beer or beverage. For those who I don't know, I'm Alexa Katz, second-year MBA, president of the Beer Club. Really excited for this event and to partner again with the Sustainability Initiative. They've been such amazing partners to our club throughout the semester, and looking forward to continuing that partnership in the future. But for those who don't know me, my background was like supply chain operations. Love beer, very much like beer is my brand outside of school. So like having this intersection of like value chain, beer, sustainability is really exciting. And one of the reasons why I was very excited to put on this event is because I think sometimes we forget that beer is a luxury product. We don't need beer to survive. Some of us might. But it's really important for us to be responsible and accountable with the way that we're producing and consuming beer. So with that, I would love to introduce Rob, who will be our moderator and our presenter for the first few minutes. Rob will give us a little bit of an introduction to the beer supply chain. We'll talk about different decision points along the way where brewers and other beer industry workers are making conscious choices to be more sustainable. I met Rob actually last semester when he was moderating a panel at Patagonia in Cambridge, and just have really enjoyed a lot of the work that he's done. He's an environmentalist, he's an educator, he's the founder of the Eco Beer blog and brand Eco-Friendly Beer. And he is doing really great work with craft brewers around the Boston area to make them more sustainable and more environmentally conscious. Before I hand it over to Rob, just want to do a quick little intro to some of the beers that we have today. So I'm drinking a hop tea right now. I don't know who may or may not be familiar with hop tea, but it's essentially a sparkling iced tea that's dry hopped the same way that beer would be dry hopped, but it's made obviously the way that tea is made. I love this as an option because unlike athletic or other non-alc beers, this isn't technically a beer. The ingredients are literally just water, hops, and carbonation. Some of them also have like other fun elements to them, like floral elements or fruit. But this is 0 calories, 0 anything. So just a great beverage at the end of the day. But without further ado, I will hand it off to Rob. He'll walk us through a little presentation and introduce the panelists for today.
Is there a clicker for the slides?
Yes, there.
We know which button moves. And I think, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Really exciting for me to have a chance to just share a little bit with you. But honestly, the real experts are going to be our panel. And I'm really excited to actually geek out and listen to and learn a little bit or a lot more from them. So yeah, so I'll introduce the panel in a couple of minutes once we get going. I'll have a few questions sort of ready for them to go. And then I think what will make the presentation really good, which always makes a class good as an educator myself, I'm constantly berating and trying to get my kids, I'm a middle school physical education and health teacher, to ask questions, because that is where so much helpful and interesting learning happens. And no questions are bad questions. If you have it, someone else probably has it. If you ask an interesting and poignant question, it gets us going in really interesting and cool directions that I may have no clue whatsoever we want to go in. So please interact with us as much as possible once we get going. And hopefully I know what I'm doing here, but maybe not. Sorry.
Who's computer?
Have the sign. Have the setting, not.
Thank you. Okay, so super fast background on me. As Alexa mentioned, I'm a craft beer aficionado or drinker for a long, long time. Got involved with visiting breweries back when something really pivotal and key happened around 2013, if I have the year right. Anybody know what happened then that really, I think, spurred this sort of, to some large extent, the craft beer growth that we've seen over the last 7 to 10 years?
Distribution?
Sort of. Used to be that if you wanted to drink beer from a brewery, you couldn't really do that. You had to basically, you could go there and you could sample a little bit, but you couldn't hang out and drink beer like you can these days. So they had a new sort of law where all of a sudden a brewery could open its own tap room, sell its own product right there on premise to everybody. And that really spurred this sort of big growth in number of breweries all over the place, and this whole new sort of aspect of culture around craft beer. So when that started happening, a friend of mine and I really got into the craft beer scene because we wanted to go and visit breweries. It was really fun. We started some social media, and we forged a really pretty good working relationship with a lot of breweries and with the Massachusetts Brewers Guild itself. Fast forward to today, I went back to the Harvard Extension School about 4 years ago to get a graduate certificate in sustainability. Had my eyes opened pretty substantially, and decided to figure out how could I then pivot with all those relationships and information that I had about craft beer and my passion for its culture, to do something that might help with the sort of environmental situations, I'll call them, that we face today. And so I was able to start Eco-Friendly Beer, which is a website and social media presence that talks about what can and should we be thinking about, especially from a consumer perspective, but also how might I be able to get the brewers and brewery owners themselves to be thinking a little bit more about it as well, although it's something that I think a lot of them have been thinking about all along. Then I got really lucky. At a webinar, I ran into an EPA Region 1, which is New England region, coordinator who's always looking for grant ideas. And he felt like, wow, I've been thinking about a grant idea to help breweries sort of get a little bit more technical assistance, is the fancy term, or consulting on how can they be maybe a little bit more environmentally conscious, and how could they get recognition for the things that they might be doing in those areas. And so that's in fact now what I'm doing as one of my 2 jobs, is working on an EPA grant at UMass Boston to basically help provide what's called the Better Bev recognition program. I'm excited to say that both Barrel House Z, which Russ is one of our panelists, will introduce him in a while, his brewery has undergone the process. They're a participant, as well as Tyler's brewery, Lamplighter here in Cambridge, is also a participant. So that's been really exciting and fun. Let's see if we can get to the next slide here. There's a battery thing there. Okay. Great. Okay. So sustainability, I'm sure everybody knows it, but it's worth thinking about a little bit before we dive in here. There are various sort of definitions, but one that I chose for today says that responsibly using natural resources today so that we are having them available for future generations to use tomorrow. And I underlined 2 words here because I think they're pivotal and really, again, worth thinking about a little bit more. I know myself, I tend, and I think most humans tend to be surface level learners. And I think that can be pretty limiting. So maybe we want to dig a little bit deeper sometimes. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of greenwashing as well today, and there's a lot of greenwashing all over the place. The word sustainability, I would argue, means next to nothing almost at this point as a result of marketing of anything and everything as, quote, sustainable. So we want to be thinking about what actually does the definition mean. So I underlined using because, and somebody mentioned it earlier, I think Alexa mentioned it earlier, using for what? What are we using our natural resources for? Are they meeting needs or are they meeting wants? From my perspective, at this point in history, there are way too many wants, I would argue, and that's kind of problematic, I think, for the future. And when we talk about future generations, again, as a pretty ardent environmentalist, I would argue, which generations are we discussing here? Only humans? Or do we care about and want to have a shared planet with the other species? Because that, again, I think is pretty vital and important to be thinking about. So again, digging a little deeper sometimes can be helpful. I've taken the liberty of stereotyping most of you. Please forgive me, but I think it will make for an interesting, again, quick little thought process. So perhaps the mental model of a business school student might be something like this. I'm sure most people have seen it, the 3 Ps, so to speak. So we've got people, planet, profit. And if you look at the bottom and then you see where it's pointing to, you see this tiny little section of overlap. Oh, that's sustainability. Again, I would argue that that is a little bit concerning and problematic. We need to get sustainability to be taking over a much, much larger portion maybe of this particular Venn diagram here. Okay, the likely model of a more ardent sort of environmentalist, and I'm sure there are some of us in this room besides myself, might look a little bit more like this. I thought this was an interesting representation. So we've obviously still got people, and we've still got planet, of course. But we've got a slightly different way of thinking about profit and maybe in terms of prosperity. And that might mean something different than just money. So again, thinking about what our sort of mental model, our way of seeing and interpreting the world is telling us about the definition of something is often, I think, worth examining. And as we see some key things here that I think, again, are notable are sort of this idea of harmonious living. So that's something I think to be valued and to be thought about, as well as sort of wanting these natural resources, again, to be around for a long time in the future. Okay, we'll have to go through this really fast because there is a lot going on, and I will reveal my ignorance if I try to delve too deeply into the brewing process itself, because I am not a brewer. Luckily, we have some brewers here who I think can answer any and all questions regarding that. But it's a far more complicated supply chain, I think, than we might, again, on the surface sort of think about. So it starts, and probably starts even before this, but you've got a farm, and then you've got a malt house, which is where you're going to get the primary ingredient in beer, I guess by volume and weight, which is malted barley. And there's some things to be thinking about there at the very, very beginning of the supply chain, and we'll talk a tiny bit about that in a few minutes. And then you've got all along the process here of actual brewing, you've got to mill it, and you've got to add your water, and you've got to start the process of brewing, and you go through, and then you're going to add your hops at a certain point, and then you're going to probably cool it and start to send it to the fermentation situation, and then you're going to add some more hops in all likelihood at some point there, because the kind of beers that people want to drink these days are often what we call dry hopped, and there's other words for that, but there's a lot more hops added. So again, those are two big sort of material places, and there's a lot of water. And then we've got, and it doesn't show it, this diagram I think is awesome, but it's missing a couple of key things from my perspective. It doesn't show the sort of cooling kind of necessities that are along this whole process. So once we get to fermentation, that's typically going to happen at a specific kind of temperature, depending on the beer style. So there's energy being used for that aspect of things. Then there may be, when the beer is ready, there may be filtration. It depends on the brewery and or again on the beer style. Another minor limitation down the bottom here is that we see bottles. No one's really doing bottles for the most part these days, unless it's a specialty type beer, maybe like a barrel-aged beer. There are a few breweries that still do bottles, but most are doing cans. But the process is the same. You're going to use water, more water there to rinse, and then you're going to be canning. It's also missing a keg, unfortunately. I would love to have a little keg down there because that would be, I think, the best way to actually package and sell the beer, especially if it can happen at these tap rooms where the beer is being brewed. And then again, you may or may not have, probably mostly no, in terms of pasteurization. That's something that the really big beer brands are likely doing because they're sending immense amounts of beer out there onto shelves and they need it to last maybe longer. But most craft breweries aren't doing any sort of pasteurization. And then you've got here again at the end, if you're distributing, which most breweries are, although most small breweries are just limiting sort of a limited amount of distribution, you've got that whole sort of transportation side of things. So again, there's a lot going on here. And it's relatively material, energy, and waste intensive. So starting again with the agricultural practices, where are these hops and these barley strains and other grains, where are they coming from and what sort of agricultural practices were being used on those farms is something to consider. Delivery miles, where do we think most of the grain is coming from? Unfortunately, not that much of it's coming from New England right now, although there is some definite movement in that direction. Similarly with hops, most of that not coming from any place particularly close, although again, that is starting to evolve and change a little bit. And then just a fun little fact, 89% of the world's water, fresh water, which is the water that actually kind of matters to humans at least, is being used mostly for agriculture and industry. And I don't know, that just to me, I was like, that seems a little bit concerning. So something to be thinking about. And again, I think breweries probably think about these kinds of things all the time, especially depending on where your brewery is, but water is a pretty key resource. And then we've got lots of emissions, unfortunately, because you do need a lot of energy, especially for heating and cooling. So thinking about where we're getting the energy and what type of energy it is for doing all of that heating and cooling. And then there is CO2 emissions, obviously, that come from some of that process, including from the fermentation itself. And then we have purchased CO2, which is typically used to actually carbonate the beer, because very few breweries at this point have any sort of carbon capture technology where they're actually capturing the carbon from the fermentation process and then reintroducing it into the beer to carbonate it. That doesn't happen on any serious scale whatsoever yet. Someday, maybe, I don't know, but not so much now. In terms of waste, there's lots of organic waste, so lots of what they call spent grains, and as well as spent hops and yeast. The good news is that most of these products are being pretty responsibly dealt with at this point. No one really is just sending things straight off to landfill, at least not in states like ours where there are sort of, organic waste bans in place. So they're heading at the very least maybe to be going to a farm so that they can either be used for animal agriculture or perhaps composted, or maybe to an anaerobic digester or something of that nature. But there's a lot happening there. Then there is wastewater that also occurs at a brewery and almost any other industry as well. And that has a lot of biological oxygen demand. So it's a fancy way of just saying that you can't send that kind of stuff straight out into waterways. Obviously, it needs to be treated first. And treatment means, again, more energy. And it means some chemical use to sort of manipulate the chemistry there. The good news on that side of things is that anybody know about Metro Boston? We have the second largest wastewater treatment facility in the country. So that is not too much of an issue. And not all of it, but much of it is also being done with renewable energy from the anaerobic digestion that happens right sort of on location over there at Deer Island. Okay, solid waste. There's a lot of that, unfortunately, in the packaging place. And a lot of that is plastic, and it's very, very difficult or near impossible to get recycled. Average water to beer ratio, and this can vary pretty wildly from one brewery to another, but in general, it's around 9-to-1. Again, meaning we're using a fair amount of water to produce our beer. Might be battery, maybe it needs to get plugged into the power source. Okay. And then energy, fair amount of energy being used. So almost 200 kilowatt hours per barrel of beer production. A barrel of beer is, for some reason, like most American measurements, sort of random. So 31 gallons is in a barrel of beer. And this includes, the kilowatt hours includes whether it be electricity and or gas. You can convert therms into kilowatt hours using a particular equation. But again, energy intensive. And then there is waste, obviously, with all the packaging that comes, because you have to, for most breweries, you have to bring all your raw ingredients and things in packaging of some sort. So again, a lot going on in this chain, and feel free to ask questions about that later. And again, our experts will be even better. So let me speed this up a little bit if I can. But what's the challenge here for the brewers to do this in an environmentally conscious way that can also sell beer, because it's obviously a business? So what do consumers want these days? This is my particular list. I'll be curious to see if I'm missing anything, or if some of our panelists think something's not quite right there. But hazy IPAs, people seem to really want that style. That seems to be the best seller at pretty much almost every brewery. People like to drink at events and outdoors. So drinking at the brewery, yes, but people want to drink beer all other places as well. So that means lots of cans to go. And then they want a plethora of choices. Most consumers seem to want a lot of different things. They may have one style that they like to focus on, but they want a different version of that style every time they go to a new tap room or to a package store or whatever. And then you've got the sort of convenience factor, which again, people want to drink when they want to drink and where they want to drink and how they want to drink. And we have a sort of culture of convenience right now in a lot of ways. So from the sustainability side of things, though, you've got some different sort of, focus places, including local ingredients, if you really want your beer to be as sustainable or as environmentally conscious as it can be. Not that easy, again, as we talked about earlier, to get local ingredients on a large scale at this point for all of your beers all of the time. You want to sell kegged draft beer, especially at your tap room, or actually at your tap room, because that's where the profit margin really lies. But from a sustainability perspective, that's really key too, because you're not using all these other materials and you're not wasting as much beer as you would be when you have to do the canning sort of process. On premise with reusable glassware is obviously the ideal scenario from a sustainability perspective. Having your beers be more regional and more seasonal so that you can match up with what's happening from an agricultural perspective in your area is also a key to sustainability factors. And last but not least, we want to reduce, reuse, and recycle as much as possible. But that can be a challenge when it's coming up against convenience. And as I think most of us are familiar with, we're not particularly good at this point in this country at reducing, reusing, or recycling. So there's huge sort of gains to be had there. So this leads us to the sort of how do we get to an environmentally conscious beer? And I think it boils down to three things, and again, maybe more, but what is your business model? That has to be really thought through if you want to try to achieve both of these things to get to an environmentally conscious beer. Note that I didn't say a sustainable beer, because I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that's really quite possible right now. In the future, could we get to a point in society where most things that we want to have are sustainable? Hopefully. I don't think we're there yet, but we can at least get to environmentally conscious, which is better than what we have right now. So the business model would be key. Figuring out the profit margin obviously matters significantly to that business model. And I think having a thoughtful mission statement, which includes the sustainability side of things, and is considered when you're making your decisions, again, will be really important in order to get to that point where we're reaching sort of environmentally conscious beer. And with that, I think I'll stop talking. Just share with you that this is a small project that I've been involved with, which was really fun. Portico Brewing, which is in Somerville. We tried to brew a beer for Earth Hour, which happened a week or so ago. And leading up through Earth Day, it should be on tap. And we tried to get the beer to be as environmentally conscious as we could. So as you can see, we did all the local ingredients. We tried to figure out a way to recycle just about everything that came in as part of that beer. We didn't get to total zero, but we got near zero waste. We did some other interesting creative measures to sort of be more efficient. And then it was, in our estimation at least, the sort of really reduced emissions with the way we were able to brew the beer compared to a regular beer. So if you're around and interested at all between now and Earth Day, swing over to Portico Brewing in Somerville and maybe check that beer out. It's a hazy pale ale, and it's pretty tasty. Cool. And that's it for me for now. I'll introduce our panelists and let them have a chance to share some things. Do you guys want to come sit up front, maybe? Thank you. Okay, so I will let each panelist introduce themselves, but as you can see by the bios here, we've got Daniel, although I feel like Daniel got shortchanged with his description here from a beer expert at least, because it only mentions his bakery experience right now, which is the industry he's in now, but 15 or so years.
There we go.
Yeah.
So I actually just moved to the bread industry this time last year. So I was in the beer industry from 2008, late 2008 until just last year, mostly in Oregon, and the last 10 years in Montana. So obviously water, big piece of that. Yeah.
Great. And then Tyler, who is the brewmaster at Lamplighter Brewing, which hopefully you've all been to at least once or many times. They've got 2 locations now. Their original location on Broadway, and then a second location over by the sort of Leechmere Tea Station called Lamplighter X.
CX, yeah. Cambridge Crossing.
Cambridge Crossing.
Does this? Yeah. All right. Yeah, we have a second tap room at Cambridge Crossing. It's brand new sort of development, new little mini city right there. But yeah, come visit sometime.
And then joining us from Zoom is Russ Heisner, who, as I was talking to Daniel and Tyler earlier, is one of the OGs of the Boston, I think arguably the OG of the Boston brewing industry. He was the founding or initial brewer at Harpoon Brewery, which was the first physical brewery to actually brew beer on premise in Boston back in 1986. Sam Adams was around for a year or two prior to that, but at the time, it was a contract brand, meaning that it was being brewed someplace else and being sold as a sort of a product, but not being brewed in Boston until I think 87 when they opened their JP brewery. So Russ, welcome. Glad you can make it.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Fantastic. So why don't we start real quick then, just with a introduction, maybe 2 minutes. You can tell us sort of your path into the craft brewing scene and whatever else you want to in terms of what you're doing now. And Daniel, maybe you can start for us.
Certainly. So like I said, I was actually living in Washington State at the time. I've lived all over the US now. And at the suggestion of my spouse, Rachel, who couldn't join us today, but my kids are sitting over here. So I told them I would try and embarrass them as much as possible since they're on spring break. At her suggestion, she thought the craft beer thing was starting to pick up steam in the Pacific Northwest, and I was at the time a home brewer and decided to try and get into the industry. So I did. I worked for about 4 years at a place in Oregon called the Pelican Pub and Brewery. Had a lot of fun there. Very well regarded brewery. And then left after 4 years to kind of try my own thing. I helped open a brewery out in Montana called Bridger Brewing, and so we grew that from a small pub with one location to 2 locations, about 20,000 barrels of annual capacity. And so did that for the last 10 years. During that time, I was also on the National Safety Board for the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. And I also, similar to Russ, did some, or not Russ to Rob, pardon me, did some work with the EPA on some waste reduction projects, and then was doing some lean manufacturing consulting with Montana State University. And so, water is kind of scarce in Montana. And so as I was building our last big production facility, our mostly automated facility, water conservation was kind of paramount because we were at the headwaters. All the water issues people are dealing with downstream, we were dealing with at the source up there in the Rocky Mountains. And so, last year decided it was time to make some space in the industry in Montana for some others who were kind of up and coming. And wanted to relocate, and environmental sustainability played a big factor in where we chose to relocate. It really kind of narrowed down where we wanted to move to, and we opted to come back to upstate New York, just because of things we were dealing with wildfires, water shortages, and things like that. We knew just where the warming planet was going, that the Rocky Mountains were not going to be a great place in the next 10 years, politically speaking as well. There was no momentum being to change that. So moved to kind of a sister industry, if you will. And so now I run one of the largest bakeries in the US, based in Albany, for the largest baking company in the world, Bimbo Bakeries USA, which is a division of Grupo Bimbo out of Mexico. So you know Sara Lee or Ballpark or any of that, that's all those brands. So. Cool.
Great, thank you. Tyler, you want to tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. I went to school for accounting, and quickly after graduating, got into beer and just started working in a brewery, working in the production side, just filling growlers all day, and eventually started moving up, cleaning tanks, brewing beer. And after working, at 2 or 3 different breweries in Massachusetts, met some Middlebury grads that wanted to open a brewery in Cambridge, and worked with them for a while. And we found the spot on Broadway, the old metric systems garage. And after about a year of build out and research and R&Ding some products, we opened, and we always had the model of being a taproom focused, community focused brewery. Certainly with regards to this presentation, we've had to deal with a lot of process issues with how to remove and treat and get rid of spent grain. It's always one of the biggest issues with every brewery. It's a waste product that you just don't want to have to spend all your time figuring out the logistics of. So we've gone through many iterations. These days we do work with a company called Against the Grain that drives around to local breweries, picks up the spent grain and drives it out to dairy farms in Massachusetts. And the cows consume it as a supplemental feed. So it's kind of a Band-Aid on the problem. But yeah, there's a lot of smart people thinking about this right now as to if we can create alternative products from that waste stream. Running the operations at Lamplighter, you're constantly met with challenges, not only on a daily basis, but long-term as to how to make your process more efficient, considering sourcing ingredients that are more sustainable while dealing with profit margins and budgets. There's a lot of decisions on a daily basis that I'd love to invest in better equipment or more sustainable processes. But it takes a lot of money and expensive equipment to make some of those things happen. Lamplighter's been open for 7.5 years now, and we've got a second tap room. We've also got a barrel warehouse in Woburn, where we produce a lot of barrel-aged mixed fermentation beers. So if you ever see any glass bottles, we still do some barrel-aged beers in glass, but primarily we're packaging in aluminum cans. Yeah, come on by the tap room sometime. Be happy to talk more afterwards too, if you have any specific questions about the brewery.
Great, thank you. And then Russ, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your journey, which is, again, as I say, goes way back.
Sure. I'm struck by the fact whenever I hear the term OG, I think of it in my terms as old guy. But yeah, I'm actually originally from Northern California in the San Jose area. I went to University of California, Davis. Graduated with a degree in fermentation sciences and had been considering winemaking jobs, biotech, and brewing. My journey actually started towards upcycling, which you're going to hear me talk about in a little bit as well. When I was working in a crush pad for Domaine Chandon, and I was in charge of trucking the pomace out into the vineyards and letting it get sit out there and turn into compost. Went back my last quarter that year before I graduated and ended up moving to Boston to help start the Harpoon Brewery, doing a research project on cellulosic materials. And that ended up being sort of a guiding North Star for me for most of my career. And I'll tell you why in a sec. Moved to Boston, 1986, literally with a with a suitcase and a little bit of change in my pocket. Slept on people's couches. We got Harpoon started in 1987. I was there through 1992. Helped consult and build probably easily more than 50 breweries across the country in the 90s. And then early 2000s, I came across a new technology company that was taking cellulosic materials, meaning paper and fiber, et cetera, and converting that into fuel-grade ethanol. So this is the usual part of this story where I say my career has been defined by ethanol for drinking and driving, and you're all supposed to laugh. We built that company. I was the number 4 employee there. We built that company into something that eventually got acquired by BP Biofuels. We were using sugarcane to gas from cane processing operations that were making sugar, and then we were turning that sugarcane to gas, the pulpy part of this stock, we fermented it into fuel-grade ethanol. About 2015, economy turned against us. BP shut us down. I decided to get back to my roots. We started Barrel House Z in Weymouth. It's a little small brewery in the South Shore. In 2015, we started operations in early 2017, but I turned around and licensed the technology back from BP because I wanted to apply it to one of the largest waste streams that come out of breweries that are currently being treated rather responsibly for animal feed, but would rather turn it into a higher value use. I was recruited by a local company here called Ginkgo Bioworks. It's a synthetic biology company. We actually tune yeast enzymes, et cetera, and biology into new processes, and a lot of them have applications in food and beverage. And so I was able to be an entrepreneur in residence there while operating Barrel House Z. We started Zenso at that point, and Zenso is going to be getting its start by taking the spent grains from breweries and distilleries, converting the fiber, their cellulosic materials, into fermentable alcoholic beverages. Barrel House Z is the first licensee of that technology, and we have actually commercially launched. It's available in our tap room. Some tasty beverages made from the process. We're currently working with other feed and ingredient companies to take the malt protein that comes off the process, and those will end up being in baking solutions as a high gluten protein that can be added to flours, et cetera. So we're in the early stages of launching Zenso. I've just formed a team, and we're off and running. And I literally am working 3 jobs, so I'm apologizing for why I'm not there today. So I wish I could be there in person, and enough of me talking.
Yeah, thank you so much, Russ. And you sort of went into and answered my second question for you, which is great. So now I will just head back in the other direction there. First, I will say that I have tried the Zenso products, both a hard seltzer as well as a ready-to-drink cocktail, and both were quite tasty. So really exciting to hear about that. Why don't we pivot to Tyler? And Tyler, I know one of your areas of passion that I'd love for you to talk a little bit about would be your use of local ingredients and support of local agriculture. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about that side of things for you.
Sure. I guess first, one of the breweries I used to work at worked a lot with Valley Malt. They're in Hadley and now Holyoke, Massachusetts. They source a lot of their barley and wheat from farms in Massachusetts and upstate New York, and they malt it in Massachusetts. And so I became familiar with some of the local farming that was being done to support the brewing industry on the barley and wheat side, as well as the hop side. And one of my part-time jobs while Lamplighter was up and running or getting up and running, I worked at a farm in Concord, helping the farmer grow and harvest corn, and just got a real appreciation for the hard work that was put into small scale and medium scale farming in our region. And knowing how condensed and small and populated New England is in general, it's becoming and has been really important to support local farms where you can. When Lamplighter was opening, I knew that it's a conscious decision was going to have to be made to use the cheapest barley as we possibly could for cost of goods reasons, as well as on the flip side of that, source locally supplied barley that is on average about 30% or 30 cents per pound more expensive than, say, like a cheap Canadian two-row. So, half of our beers, just about, give or take, are brewed with barley and wheat and oats grown in Maine and Massachusetts. There's another maltster called Blue Ox Malt House, just north of Portland. And they put out some fabulous products. For me, it's not only a quality decision, it's a ecological decision. It's shorter supply chain, freshness of, the malt itself. And when I spend $1 on malt from Maine, I'm keeping that dollar in New England, supporting farmers and all the other individuals that are part of that supply chain. So, as much as if you want to brew a traditional English style beer and source some floor malted English pale malt, and it has to come over on a ship, we certainly buy some English malt, but I'd rather I'd rather brew with locally sourced ingredients because you can just taste the quality and the freshness when it comes to brewing with that malt. It is shelf stable, but at the same time, just like beer, malted barley will lose some of its just freshness and quality over time. So I really like the beers we put out with Blue Ox's malt, and we've developed a great relationship with them. And I think in 2021, 50% of our barley came from Maine that we brewed with that year. We're always kind of looking at our recipes and what we're brewing and what sells, and trying to keep a balance between being a community-focused taproom as well as a production brewery that about 70% of our volume moves through distribution channels. So whether that's packaged in a can or a keg, we like to have a variety on tap, but at the same time, a sales and distribution team doesn't want to have 16 SKUs to sell to Wegmans. So it's a balance of, working with our production schedule, our cold storage and sales and distribution teams to decide what we're brewing and when, and converting recipes over to locally sourced ingredients versus maintaining a healthy profit margin on other beer. I mean, honestly, anytime you dry hop a beer, most of the cost of that beer is going to be in the hops themselves, which, we could do a whole talk about the state of the hop industry right now, but, it's not good. So yeah, another real quick, 4 Star Farms in Northfield, Massachusetts. If you ever want to take a trip out on Route 2, highly recommend visiting that farm. They also have a brewery there, 4 Star Farms Brewery. They make great beer. They source all their hops from their own farm, and they started growing some barley, and they have 1 or 2 brands that are 100% grown by them, which is really fascinating. I did a lot of research into like what it takes to brew like the farm style brewery, and a lot of the consideration and cost, which Rob touched on, would be in the waste streams and your effluent, side streaming and composting, returning it to the ground, managing your water pH neutralization and your BOD and COD. And if you're brewing on a septic system anywhere in this country, you have a lot of challenges. So we are certainly blessed in Cambridge to have Deer Island. When we first opened up, we called them up to say, what do we need to set up in terms of wastewater management? And they kind of chuckled on the phone and said, you can see us from space. Don't worry about it. So we are certainly lucky brewing in a city. The other downside of brewing in a city, getting rid of spent grain. No farmer wants to have to drive into the city and pick up spent grain. So that's where Against the Grain comes in. They saw a business model to get paid on both ends. The brewery wants to get rid of the grain, needs to get rid of the grain on a daily basis. And the farmers would love to have supplemental feed for their cows or pigs or chickens. So, it's certainly something that every aspect, like Rob showed you in that diagram, there's waste streams coming everywhere, whether it's organic or inorganic. So it's extremely challenging as a small craft brewery to make the conscious decision to target 1 or 2 or 3 or as many as you can different waste streams and say, how can we do this to the best of our ability without being in the red every year?
Okay, which leads us really nicely into my last question, and then we'll open it up for all of you, which Daniel, I'm hoping you can further what Tyler sort of started there, which is this conundrum of balancing selling beer and profitability with trying to do it in an environmentally conscious way, and maybe just some things that really you remember that were very relevant for you and your brewery, and I think most of them extend out to most breweries in the country.
Yeah, so when we're starting a business or running a business, right, we want to try and minimize the inputs to maximize the outputs, right, and maximize that contribution margin. And we really have to look at it very differently when we're talking about it from a sustainability standpoint, because most breweries, and I won't say all breweries, most breweries don't have the economy of scale, the purchasing power to get the technologies required into a facility to do things like carbon recapture or in-house water treatment, things like that. So it can be tricky. On my last project, it was a $15 million build out. 2 million of that was on the water capture system alone, and that was because we didn't have a Deer Island. We were 30 miles from the nearest city. Montana is the 4th largest state in the country. There's only just over 1 million people. And between cities, you have a 2 or 3 hour drive of literally nothingness. I've driven from there to upstate New York in my Tesla, and it's a very desolate drive. And so we didn't have any infrastructure, so we had to build our own. So, talking about septic tanks and things like that, it's a huge cost, but it's the right thing to do. It's very tricky as well when we look at just what the upfront cost is. When you're building a business and you're taking on investments or trying to explain things to a risk-adverse institution like private equity or a bank, and you're trying to say like, hey, I've got this great idea that nobody's ever done in a rural part of the state, and all Montana banks want to hear is real estate investment because everybody wants to move to Montana for the skiing. So it is tricky on the ingredient side as well. Profitability for us, buying local meant anything from the entire state, which when you're as big as Montana means, it's a 3-hour drive for my delivery truck to bring my malted barley down. And so we tried to source as much in-state as possible, just out of necessity, because Montana is a crux of barley and wheat growing in the U.S. So that wasn't really an issue for us on the sourcing side, but it is still a big greenhouse gas contributor on the logistic transportation side. Hops are much trickier, right? Montana is not historically known as a traditional hop growing region. It's a lot of dry land. It's 4,700 feet or higher in elevation in the western part of the state where I was. And you have to irrigate. And when you don't have a lot of water, your hops, even when they're locally grown, are going to cost more because of that. You have to help pay for that infrastructure. And then just because of the other logistics of getting hops in from Michigan or from more traditional areas like Yakima or the Willamette Valley on the West Coast, you're paying exponentially more in shipping costs. And so you're trying to balance the consumer desire for this new fun hop, this new ingredient with, a break-even point. And so it is important to try and maximize in-house sales from that regard. But there's no perfect answer. We ended up working with some private equity and trying to convince them to help see the vision from an environmentally sustainable standpoint. But it was a significant upfront cost. And even, when we were getting that second facility started just after COVID, which was tough in its own right, trying to source equipment from, Germany and the Midwest. And then you've got a bank that's, waiting for payments and things like that, and you're not even up and running yet. So, it's kind of a rambling answer.
Thank you. Let's take some questions from the audience. I'd love to have you jump in on anything that was discussed or anything whatsoever at all. You've got some really good experts here to talk about anything beer related.
Hi. So question I had, it sounds like both of you talked about the geographical difficulties and uniqueness that you have both in getting spent grain out of the city and how you have access to malt, but not hops, for instance. How do you think it will be to have the entire industry change? Is that a brewery by brewery, region by region kind of solution? Is there any, is it all going to have to be regionally dependent for how you make the change to?
Personally, I've been meeting with a lot of New England hop growers every month, and we've talked a lot about that question. And what we've kind of ironed it all down to is the consumer's flying the plane here, and we're all just sitting in the back, just being like, land the plane safely, please. The more we can get to consumers and educate them about, say, nugget grown in Massachusetts and the flavor properties it has and how wonderful it is, the more the consumer is going to say, hey, I want that beer, that IPA that has mass grown nugget, and not just like, oh, I know Citra and Mosaic. Those are proprietary, very big corporate controlled hops that is more of a monopoly and suppresses the local farms that grow these wonderful, unique varieties. So the more that we can educate the consumers to say, this is why this beer matters, it's going to incentivize the brewers to buy local hops or local malts to make those beers, because someone that's running a brewery that's more cost conscious or operations focused and not a brewer running operations, they're likely just going to say, we're using the cheapest possible ingredients. We're going to negotiate down prices. What are our sales? What's our sales data look like? We're brewing that beer, cut costs. And if we can incentivize brewers to spend a little bit more money on locally produced ingredients, I think we can make changes there. But for the most part, what you spend your dollar on is what matters, because at the end of the day, we're selling a product and we have to make what sells. But I guess that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, hyper local, that's really the way it has to go. We have to be okay as consumers saying, I'm making a conscious choice with my money to not buy a trademarked hop variety that, you know, a big growing co-op is trying to recoup their 30 years of invested research into, which is tough, right? I get why they're doing it. We see this in apples. We see this in a lot of other varieties as well. But knowing that it's on me to not buy a hop that is grown in New Zealand and shipped halfway across the planet, so that I can pay, I don't even know what Boston beer prices are right now. It's been like 10 years since I've been back in Boston, so I'm sure they're crazy. You know, it's a consumer-driven market, like you were saying, and so to a certain extent, the consumer sets the price, right? I'm only willing to spend this much for a pint, and we've got to work within that. And so the more the ingredient costs, the less there is to go back into the business for some of those other things. And so, yeah, spending with your dollar is the way to go. At the end of the day.
And real like, I deal with this every day at the grocery store too. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they eat an ungodly amount of berries. And you know, I'm buying raspberries, and I know they're not in season, but you know, my kids love raspberries, and so it's really tough as a consumer to be like, well, I know these berries aren't locally grown. Of course, they're not locally grown. How are you going to get locally grown raspberries in March? So yeah, I mean, I've heard people make the argument of like, oh,